Hi, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to Durham for hosting me and for keeping me in the style to which I wish to become accustomed. It's been very nice. So I want to take this opportunity, which is my first proper lecture since I gave birth 5 months ago, and the produce of that labour is sitting at the back waiting to heckle me as we go forward, to present new work, as Mark said. So this is from a book that was supposed to be completed before I went away on maternity leave, but which is still very much under construction. And being able to talk to you about it today has given me a chance to really reconnect with the project and to get back into the swing of things. So I'd like to say thank you in advance for giving me the opportunity and for your indulgence. So the project, which I am co-authoring with my baby's father, which is a recipe for fun and tension for everybody, looks appropriately enough at social reproduction. So social reproduction or reproductive labour are terms used to describe the everyday tasks involved in staying alive and helping others stay alive. So the maintenance of people, spaces and communities. We're talking about things like child rearing, housework, elder care and so on, which have traditionally been performed mostly by women for low wages or for no wages, and which increasingly seem to exist in a perpetual state of crisis. The broad argument of the book is that social reproduction tends to get left out or tacked on to some of the most high-profile emancipatory projects emerging from the left today. So it's particularly concerned with so-called post-work politics, a loose assemblage of positions seeking to intervene within the crisis of work, including the looming spectre of technological unemployment. Such positions don't lobby for the end of automation or for the creation of more jobs, but instead seek to challenge the hold that wage labour has on the social imagination. They return to the classic demand of organised labour for a shorter working day, week, life. In short, for the minimisation of toil and the maximisation of collective autonomy. They think about how best to do away with unnecessary drudgery, challenge a pervasive work ethic that tells us that our worth is our productivity, and encourage a fuller, richer understanding of what constitutes a life well lived. Now, that all sounds pretty great, except that these positions have so far, and with notable exceptions, tended to exhibit a short-sighted focus on wage labour, on a rather particular vision of wage labour at that. Sectors like manufacturing and logistics are often front and centre. Nurseries, hospitals and care homes less so. It will come as no surprise then that the home is very often left out of these emancipatory visions, either rendered invisible or celebrated as a sphere of alternative values and relative freedom. This is somewhat inauspicious from a feminist perspective. Forms of labour that are mainly and problematically associated with cis men are explicitly targeted as areas for resistance and refusal, whilst work that has conventionally, and again problematically, been gendered as feminine gets a rather different treatment. Sometimes it is simply ignored, sometimes it's lauded, and at other times, it's framed as a space into which post-work imaginaries should not hope to tread. So in all of these scenarios, post-work thinkers are not actively developing strategies to minimise that work. So according to this vision, masculinised labour is escaped, whilst feminised labour endures or multiplies, all in a fashion that supposedly marks the end of work. And of course, there are aspects of social reproduction, as it is currently organised, which one would not wish to project indefinitely into the future. Housework and care work are work. Their heaviest burdens are unevenly distributed across the population, and they include elements of drudgery, immiseration and unfreedom that any thoroughgoing would-be emancipatory project should not ignore. So this is a challenge that we set ourselves in the book, to devise ways of extending post-work's ambitions to the reproductive sphere. We advance various suggestions regarding how one might do this, ranging from the judicious use of technology to the abolition of the family. Easy. Today, though, I want to concentrate on just one of the proposals that we make, the demand to rethink domestic space. The home has always been a workplace, both for those who work for no pay and those who work for low pay. As such, we need to clear some space within post-work politics for an engagement with the home, its architecture, its organisation, its design. The domestic sphere has for too long been denuded of a sense of political opportunity. Despite a rich heritage of historical experimentation in domestic design and community planning, contemporary feminists in the global north have largely come to accept the spatial design of the home as an inevitable part of domestic life. I call this tendency domestic realism, after Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, rather than the literary genre. The obstinacy of domestic imaginaries in the face of otherwise extensive visions of socio-technical overhaul. Domestic realism names the phenomenon whereby the isolated and individualised small dwelling and the concomitant privatisation of household labour becomes so accepted and commonplace that it's almost impossible to imagine life being organised in any other way. That this occurs despite many people's lived experiences of the pressures and difficulties attendant upon home-based reproductive labour as it's currently organised only serves to make it more remarkable, I think. What's more, the home represents a prolific site of violence and abuse. Only last month, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime declared the home the most dangerous place for women on account of the number of women and girls killed there at the hands of intimate partners and family members. And yet, the house all too rarely registers as a political issue. It's our contention that this represents a crucial and often overlooked example of material hegemony in action. Domestic dwellings can be understood as contributing to the solidification of governance through the subtle closing off of options and the production of generalised consent to an existing order. But there are many possible forms of domestic arrangement, both spatial and relational, aside from the atomized and depoliticized family home. Indeed, it is important that we understand the built environment and its infrastructures, not only as a means for registering and consolidating dominant political positions, but as potential sites for intervention and as territories of contestation as well. Opening up the geographies and infrastructures of reproductive labour may be one way of contributing to the construction of a new kind of explicitly feminist post-work common sense. So what I'll be presenting today is one section of what's really quite an idiosyncratic genealogy, a partial history of alternatives to conventional single-family residences, all of which in some way seek to problematise, challenge or reorganise unpaid domestic labour. The history that we sketch out in the book extends from the cooperative kitchens and apartment hotels proposed by social reformers in the 1900s, through mid-century fantasies of the fully automated future home, to the rather soulless commercial co-living developments aimed at today's digital nomads. Some of these experiments have more emancipatory potential than others. For the purposes of today's talk, I've chosen to concentrate on 3 case studies that are perhaps particularly imbued with nascent post-work potential. All 3 are social or state-subsidised housing projects developed in Europe during the interwar years. One from Frankfurt, one from Vienna, and one from Stockholm. The questions I want to ask of each of them are, how did they approach the issue of gendered reproductive labour? Why, ultimately, did they fail to enact a lasting or wide-ranging challenge to domestic realism? And what might we learn from them in our attempts to construct a feminist post-work imaginary today? So we begin in the mid-1920s, when several German municipalities found themselves facing a housing shortage, and an amalgamation of government agencies was set up to look into all aspects of housing production and design. The city of Frankfurt sought to redress the emerging crisis by appointing architect Ernst May as head of the Department of Housing and City Planning. He and his team succeeded in building an impressive 15,000 housing units by the end of the decade. As a result, 1 in 11 residents in Frankfurt obtained a new apartment, most of them in large, modern-looking housing estates which sort of circled the city. One of the key characteristics of these new dwellings was their innovative approach to domestic design. Around 2/3 featured the so-called Frankfurt Kitchen, created by architect Margareta Schütte-Lohotzky in 1926. This was the first specially designed kitchen type to be mass-produced as standard equipment for social housing, and its design represented the increasingly popular application of scientific management techniques to the home. Up until this point, kitchens had been largely designed in quite an ad hoc manner, without much formal investigation into the intricacies of domestic work processes. Lohotsky's aim was to apply techniques aimed at efficiency in the waged workplace to the unwaged, in short, to tailorize the home. As June Freeman notes, a time and motion study was conducted to determine the Frankfurt Kitchen's optimum size. The answer arrived at was 1.9 metres by 3.44 metres. The preferred galley-style layout was carefully determined through the study of a housewife's movements in preparing food, setting the table, and doing the dishes. Its minimal floor area was not simply a matter of reducing costs, although this was obviously a factor in the design of housing project flats, but also a way of minimising distances between cupboard, counter, stove, and sink. The aim was to construct an easier-to-use, less time-consuming, and generally more pleasant working environment for reproductive labours. Lohotsky intended the Frankfurt Kitchen to be light and modern, with sleek tiled surfaces, gleaming appliances, and aluminium fittings. She paid close attention to the height of cupboards to ensure that they could be reached comfortably, planned a suspended lamp which could be moved along a runner on the ceiling as to get light to every part of the room, and included a height-adjustable stool to make it easier for people to sit while working. In keeping with the principles of scientific management, this sensitivity to ergonomic design emphasised the role of the kitchen not as a sentimentalised heart of the home, but as a rationalisable workplace. In so doing, the Frankfurt Kitchen gestured towards the possibility of reducing some of the temporal and physical burdens associated with housework. During this period, the scientific management of some forms of domestic labour was promoted as the primary way of reducing the working woman's triple burden of job, household chores, and child rearing. Lohotsky was at pains to emphasise that her design intended to liberate women and contribute to their emancipation by minimising the time they had to spend on domestic chores. Certainly, as Hildy Heynen notes, the rational and functional layout of the kitchen did much to reduce the energy and effort required to run a household, thus facilitating the lives of housewives and enabling them to increase their leisure time by lessening their workload. However, the Frankfurt Kitchen vision was not without problems, problems which substantially diminish its post-work potential. Practical issues abounded in relation to Lohotsky's design, due in large part to a mismatch between her ambitions for the space and the material conditions of those who would be using it. Not only were residents themselves required to finance much of the equipment required for the kitchen's optimal running, but the electricity bills that it generated were considerably higher than many were used to. And the diminutive dimensions of the kind of the galley layout also generated issues. So a lack of space meant that children would be sent out to other rooms, which then meant it was harder for a reproductive labourer to keep watch of them as they were doing their kitchen-based chores. The assembly line assumptions of scientific management, where tasks are completed step by step, were perhaps ill-suited to the multitasking nature of social reproduction. Furthermore, there are certain assumptions embedded in the Frankfurt Kitchen that function directly counter to Lohotsky's ambitions of emancipating women and reducing domestic drudgery. In fact, the space arguably served to enact and reinforce material hegemonies within the sphere of gendered reproductive labour, as it was deliberately designed for the use of one adult woman. The standard heights of countertops and cabinets were ergonomically fitted to the measurements of women, not men, and the available space did not easily accommodate two people working in the kitchen. The design itself, then, is shot through with expectations as to who would be performing this work, in a neat example of the co-constitutive character of social and spatial norms. As Helen remarks, this arrangement is an eloquent example of how architectural layouts contributed to the petrification of social patterns. By sedimenting the 1920s status quo, the household as the responsibility of women, into a specific space, the Frankfurt Kitchen model hindered any possibility of gradual change when feminists started to call for a more equitable distribution of domestic labour. The space was simply not designed to accept the participation of a helping husband or child, which could have been a first step towards that end. Whilst Lohotsky's efforts do have the potential to foster the rejection of unwanted elements of domestic labour, thereby enabling her contemporaries to better refuse the work of housework. They also placed clear restrictions upon redistribution as one key means of achieving this. Within the Frankfurt Kitchen, there is quite literally no room for change. One area where this case study might yield helpful insights, however, is in terms of our understanding of where post-work spatial innovations might arise. In the case of the Frankfurt Kitchen, we see that this novel approach to kitchen design was only realised on any significant scale in public housing. The introduction of changes in the layout and design of domestic kitchens for the middle classes, whether German, American or English, was slower. For at this social level, designers could not impose their ideas. The public had to be convinced of the virtues of the fitted kitchen. Whilst the top-down imposition of domestic imaginaries is hardly something to celebrate, this does point to the idea that, in particular contexts, social housing has enabled the widespread adoption of new, forward-looking approaches to managing reproductive labour, approaches that have been explicitly advanced with the goal of increasing people's discretionary time. The possibilities afforded by social housing in the 1920s and 1930s, possibilities of mass adoption and implementation of radical new ideas about domestic spatial imaginaries, meant that housing projects of the kind pursued in Frankfurt held considerable appeal for avant-garde practitioners across various disciplines. At that historical moment, urban social housing was produced not only in response to a shortage of affordable housing, but also to show paradigmatically what a planned welfare city would look like. Politicians, architectural theorists, and municipal planners alike explored radical ideas about the role of space in politics, and more particularly, the role that architecture and urban form could play in the construction of an urban socialist society. We can see this quite clearly in our second case study from the interwar years, which is the city in which Lohotsky cut her teeth as a young architect and first experimented with labour saving, and that was the so-called Red Vienna. So Vienna, like Frankfurt, was subject to a housing crisis around this period. That's all right, it'll be fine. A census taken after World War I indicated that up to 3/4 of domestic dwellings in the city took the form of teeny tiny apartments of a single room plus kitchen. And they were frequently without electricity, gas, running water, or their own toilets, and suffered from poor lighting and ventilation. These living quarters were not only small and ill-equipped, but they were also expensive, so typically absorbing 25% of the average worker's salary. And that's when they were available at all. So the supply of rental properties was grossly inadequate, and homelessness was rife throughout the city in this period. As Eve Blau notes in her influential history of Viennese housing in the interwar years, a significant number of desperate city residents found themselves living in wild settlements, shanty towns made up of sheds, huts, and makeshift lodges erected in the city's allotment gardens in the wake of the conflict. As one might expect, these settlements, which were without plumbing and electricity, they also had to be constructed without reference to any building codes and just using whatever materials you could get your hands on. And they were judged to be unsightly as well as unsafe. As Vienna looked to regain its equilibrium after the war, the municipality sought to take on a more active role in regulating settlements of this kind, whilst also addressing the city's housing crisis as a whole. Unlike May's Frankfurt, the municipality of Red Vienna decided to build housing inside the city limits rather than in a ring around the outside, meaning that architects had to find ways of inserting large building complexes into the existing urban tissue. Apartments were laid out along city streets, sometimes occupying entire blocks. Designed and built as part of a swathe of municipal reforms instigated by the Social Democratic City Council between 1919 and 1934, these ambitious housing schemes can be seen as part of a political strategy concentrated on building hegemony within the confines of the city. They were consciously the harbingers of a new socialist world, one that both prioritised working class needs and fostered more communal ways of living. The housing blocks encircled large open courts that were intended to act as the focal point of residents' social lives. The radical building programme was not just a matter of erecting more homes, although it did increase housing resources in the city by 11%, meaning that by the end of the Social Democrats' tenure, up to 1/8 of the total population of Vienna was housed in municipal dwellings, built almost entirely out of the city's annual income. This programme was in fact complemented by, and to some extent integrated with, a wave of municipalisation and nationalisation within the reproductive sector. As Veronika Dumer and Hannah Lichtenberger note, the administration focused on spheres that we would today consider care work, nursing, medical care, education, and so on, and equipped them with improved infrastructure and significantly increased resources. This intersected with the city's housing programme via the provision and location of some collective services focused on social reproduction. Viennese city planners and social reformers alike favoured large-scale apartment living accompanied by extensive communal services. Workers' dwellings were incorporated with kindergartens, libraries, medical and dental clinics, laundries, workshops, theatres, cooperative stores, public gardens, sports facilities, and a wide range of other public facilities. Measures funded via progressive taxation targeting luxury goods such as cars and champagne, as well as the services provided by household servants. Again, these design choices were explicitly related to ideas regarding the drudgery of domestic labour, with feminists within the socialist movement recommending both the professionalisation of physically demanding domestic work and apartment living in general as less labour-intensive for women than single-family forms of housing. This was often framed in the most emancipatory terms, with architects, including Lohotsky, arguing that large complexes with shared facilities would give working-class women more time for political organising and civic engagement. Indeed, promotional images of Red Vienna's individual apartments tend to depict a family at rest. Girls, in particular, are shown engaged in intellectual pursuits, reading, studying, lost in thought. Furthermore, as Blau remarks, the private space of the apartment was not typically the focus of these illustrations. The city produced and published a far greater number of images of the communal laundries, libraries, clinics, childcare facilities, kindergartens, public baths, gardens, parks, playgrounds, swimming and wading pools, theatres, lecture halls and the like, emphasising that the new political and economic life of the proletarian city was to be shaped not in the private space, but in the public and communal space provided in the new buildings. Not only are the laundries, clinics and other communal facilities shown in full operation, but they are also depicted as the sites of technological, sociological and scientific innovation in the new socialist city. The radical gender political potential of these attempts at shaping a new form of socialised proletarian life, along with the possibilities of diverting understandings of luxury towards the communal, are quite tantalising for 21st century post-work feminisms. The historical example of Red Vienna shows that far-reaching and transformational ideas can be made into reality, albeit in a specific situation in which massive pressure from below pushed through reforms. However, we must not downplay the problematic elements of the Viennese project, nor overlook the barriers that prevented its expansion and ultimately stopped it in its tracks. Firstly, there were failures, or at least limitations, in terms of the way communal services were implemented. They did not relieve the domestic burden of housewife and mother in quite the way they were intended to, or were portrayed as doing in the city's official literature. Nurseries, for example, failed to operate in a manner maximally helpful to working-class parents. They only accepted children at age 4, so younger children needed alternative care. Some opened at 8 a.m, though the average workday began at 7 a.m. Some did not provide lunches, and most closed for extended holidays. These gaps in professional childcare provision might not have been such a problem for families if wider kinship and solidarity networks hadn't also been compromised at around the same time, often via deliberate interventions from the Social Democrats, intended to foster the nuclear family as the privileged Viennese social unit. Housing policy within the city favoured a very particular kind of household arrangement. So this is reflected in the point system that was put in place in 1922, which was used by the Viennese authorities to assess the eligibility of applicants for municipal housing and rank them according to need. So this scheme took into account things like marital status and the number of children, as well as disability, citizenship, current place of residence, and so on. The effect of the point system, together with the small size of the apartments themselves, favoured smaller families with 1 or 2 children, since before moving into city housing, such families had lived with parents or in-laws. The system ultimately worked to dismantle established forms of support network. Indeed, it's worth noting that some historians of Red Vienna's building programme have argued that working class women were actually disadvantaged by the move into the new housing, since it meant living without the support of extended family members and without the building family of traditional working class tenements. Red Vienna's new vision of the proletarian dwelling helped dismantle the traditional working class household without reconstituting the network of support and association it had supplied. As such, when communal services such as kindergartens failed to fully meet the needs of residents, the effects were all the more acutely felt. There were related issues in terms of the city's high-spec collective laundries, facilities that were often considered something of a showpiece for these schemes. Households were only allocated a single wash day every month, meaning that residents were expected to complete this chore, which was perhaps the heaviest activity of domestic labour at that time, to somebody else's time frame under conditions of work intensification. What's more, the only men permitted to enter these spaces were those employed as laundry supervisors. Whilst this was ostensibly to protect the modesty of women who removed their outer clothing to do the washing, the effect was to enforce a rigidly gendered division of labour. Men could not help with the monthly wash, even if they were willing to do so. As with the case of the Frankfurt Kitchen, then, we see that the post-work promise of interwar social housing experiments is very much marred by the obstinacy of gender ideologies. While some elements of domestic realism, including the individualisation of reproductive labour, are open to confrontation and challenge in these schemes, others, such as the gendering of this labour, are not. And other potentially oppressive norms, such as the privileging of the nuclear family unit, were in the process of petrifying, thanks to organisational and policy infrastructures. Historians of urban planning have been quite clear about the limitations and the failures of Red Vienna's social housing initiative. And critics have been at pains to delegitimise the idea of an architectural quick fix, stressing instead the inexorable connections between spatial and social relations. Indeed, from a post-work perspective, there are many aspects of the project that generate more problems than they can hope to solve. It's my contention, however, that despite what may to 21st century eyes appear to be glaring faults, Red Vienna offers us a compelling example of forgotten futures. It illustrates that the fight for a better quality of life should not just concentrate upon single-family dwellings, the facilities available within individual households, and the leisure time these might free up, but upon a broader idea of communal luxury. Post-work thinkers might consider pushing for wider access to shared spaces and resources, be these for organising, for play, for self-realisation, or for rest. The eventual quashing of the Social Democrats marks the closure of one particularly poignant line of untapped possibility in terms of wider efforts to uproot domestic realism and construct material counter-hegemonies responsive to the needs of reproductive labourers. In 1934, the Austro-fascist government removed Vienna's administration in the course of its military evisceration of the labour movement as a whole, and appointed commissioners to rule the city. These commissioners were quick to reverse the municipality's efforts to redistribute wealth through progressive taxation, and public housing projects were largely abandoned, rents rose, and social insurance and infrastructures were dismantled. And yet, the influence of the socialist building project can still be felt within the city today. Infrastructure, once established, tends to be characterised by its capacity to persist. This infrastructural endurance plays a key role in the operations of material hegemony. As such, it is perhaps no surprise that contemporary Vienna still exhibits a commitment to affordable and high-quality housing for all. Although the city feels the effects of gentrification and rising rents, It maintains a relatively high public housing budget when compared to metropoles of similar size. Indeed, as the architect and writer Gabu Heindel notes, social housing in the city continues to include shared amenities such as swimming pools and saunas, in keeping with Red Vienna's historical favouring of communal space. So today, around 2/3 of Viennese citizens live in municipal or publicly subsidised housing, with the city itself serving as Austria's biggest landlord. Having the municipality play such a significant role in the provision of accommodation has had a notable effect on the housing landscape in Vienna. At one point, as Heindel notes, the city was at risk of being sued by large private corporations who accused it of disrupting the workings of the free market by providing such a substantial share of housing stock. The only way to resist such arguments, she says, is the rejection of the idea that housing is a commodity. Okay, so the final example of interwar communal living that I want to consider today was developed in Sweden in the midst of the creation of the welfare state. In the 1930s, the peace campaigner, politician and feminist scholar Alva Mördel collaborated with the modernist architect Sven Markelius to create a housing complex in the centre of Stockholm, which integrated 57 small apartments of very elegant design with shared facilities such as workspace, food service and childcare. During this period, cooperative housing represented one key strand of the city's approach to housing shortages, and around 200 residences of this kind were erected by 1937, many supported by organisations such as Stockholm's Tenants Savings and Building Society. Unlike numerous other projects built by cooperative housing societies, however, Mördel and Markelius's collective house was not aimed at low-income households. Opening in 1935, it served a somewhat different demographic, comfortably off, middle-class nuclear families in which both parents were professionals who worked outside the home. Although it had initially been hoped that the government would fund the collective house, it eventually came to be financed via a combination of state subsidy, loans from a private building firm, and direct contributions from tenants, whose service fee was pooled to cover the cost of communal resources. As a result, collective house dwellings were well beyond the means of many working-class households. Rather than seeking to re-engineer proletarian civic and social existence, as Red Vienna had done, the project was occupied by an intellectual elite of psychoanalysts and educators. Indeed, as Dolores Hayden notes, Markelius himself chose to occupy the property and served as an unofficial handyman for 30 years in order to make sure that everything about the building worked and to demonstrate his commitment to social housing. The collective house was kitted out with many of the common resources and modern conveniences characteristic of ambitious cooperative living experiments in the first half of the 20th century. It combined facilities like central heating with resources such as a small on-site grocery store, a childcare centre offering supervision both day and night, a restaurant, repair facilities, a laundry room and a communal kitchen. Mördel and Markelius were keen to strike a balance between individualised and socialised domestic labour. For example, they ensured that each apartment had its own kitchenette, so residents had the option of cooking for themselves if they wished to. Households could also request that meals prepared in the communal kitchen be sent directly to their apartment via an electric food lift. So the idea being you get home from work, you take the lift up to your apartment, you check out the menu, and you call down and somebody sends it up in your jazzy electric food lift. In addition to providing shared facilities and in-apartment amenities, the collective house also employed a workforce of over 20 people to deliver a range of domestic services collectively financed by residents. These paid reproductive labourers were responsible for much of the complex's cooking, cleaning and caring, from staffing the restaurant to washing the laundry. As Nicholas Marx suggests, this scheme both expressed and was driven by a compelling idea. Habitation was to be freed of all the nuisances that prevented women in particular from having a job. The promise was that, without the need to cook or do laundry, people could focus on life. And yet, as the phrasing of this comment implies, the post-work potential of this endeavour was limited. As with many similar endeavours, there was an emphasis on the displacement rather than the eradication of labour performed by women. It is not life that becomes the focus of these endeavours, so much as working life. the burdens of the home are reduced in order to allow mothers to take on further professional burdens. This is something Mark is quite quick to acknowledge. So he says, the joys of raising children, of cooking together, of life in the large family kitchen, all this was over. Instead, a bare-knuckle functionalism governed all areas of life. Eating was nothing but intake of food, and living nothing but waiting for the next work effort. Furniture was barren equipment made of steel tubing, in which people were bent into shape, like in clamps, for a fully rationalised life according to the dictate of increased efficiency. The steel tube chair next to the sleeper, a seemingly liberating concentration on the basics to some, has a chilling effect on those who see in it the disciplining incursion of a heartless world of tubes, conduits and machines into what used to be the snug preserve of blissfully lazy evenings on the nostalgic velvet sofa. The reception of the collective house illustrates how one and the same architectural form can be interpreted, depending on one's point of view, either as emancipating mankind from the form of housing that made women in particular slaves of the household, or as the implementation of capitalist optimization processes in the private sphere. So that's the end of that quote. So there are some important points there. It certainly seems odd that living experiments of this period would start from the assumption that the dynamics of the tailorized workplace deserve to be rolled out across the entire social factory. And of course, any project constructed around maximizing time for wage labour at the expense of traditionally feminized work of social reproduction can hardly be taken as an unproblematic example of post-work feminism. But I'm not sure it's helpful to recycle the ideal of the home as a haven in a heartless world either. At least not without doing the detailed work of unpicking the gendered ideologies and public-private binaries underpinning this ideal. For whom, we might ask, has the large family kitchen represented a space of collective joy? How much has cooking really been an activity that's done together rather than a chore imposed on one particular subset of the population? Who's enjoying those long, lazy evenings on the velvet sofa, and how much does their enjoyment depend upon the unacknowledged labour of whoever is cleaning between the cushions? It would be deeply unfortunate if we were drawn into uncritically rebadging domestic realism and the continued imposition of reproductive labour as visions of right living, simply because they represent one of the few territories still misunderstood as a potential refuge from the worst vicissitudes of capitalism. Conversely, we would do well to recognise that not all the activities currently associated with wage labour necessarily represent a straightforward encroachment upon an individual's autonomy. For affluent Swedish women in the 1930s, the opportunity to engage in what they felt was personally meaningful and socially recognised labour outside of the home was highly valued. Indeed, this is what attracted an elite class of professionals to the collective house in the first place. It was seen to represent a possible broadening of horizons and an extension of individual autonomy with the scope for greater human flourishing, if only for the privileged few who were in a position to make the most of such opportunities. As such, we see that certain elements of wage labour have been understood or misunderstood as a largely self-chosen pursuit. There's a tension here between compulsion and autonomy, a tension that cannot easily be mapped onto activities based simply on their category or type. Just as cooking can indeed be a skillful and enjoyable pastime, as well as a frustratingly burdensome form of drudge work, so too can some of the activities of remunerated labour be experienced as fulfilling and desirable, as well as an imposition resulting from generalised wage dependency under capitalism. How a particular activity is experienced depends largely upon historical context, material conditions, the circumstances in which it is performed, the person doing it, and so on. This is one reason why in the book we argue for a reframing of post-work politics in terms of the fight for free time. We stress that the refusal of work may be only one possible manifestation of an emancipatory struggle for collective autonomy, a struggle which takes various forms depending on the navigation of structural oppressions. In the case of the residents of Stockholm's collective house, a realm of social life and cultural capital from which women had up until that point been largely excluded, came to represent a sphere of potential agency more than it did a potential oppression. issue with Mardell and Markelius's cooperative project were not limited to this veneration of high-status professional labour, however. The building itself presented certain material challenges. The apartments, which were already beyond the means of many working-class households, tended to be too small to comfortably accommodate larger families. As Juliana Vassarino-Gerti notes, promotional materials for the collective house implied that apartments of between 34 and 45 metres squared could house families with as many as 3 children. Yet a one-bedroom apartment of less than 50 metres squared with a small living room and dining area could hardly be expected to accommodate a family with 3 children when it would have housed a family with 1 child with difficulty. At this point, the collective houses' shared services and facilities cease to appear as luxurious labour-saving perks and start to be seen as non-negotiable requirements. If one does not have the private space required to cook a meal for visitors, then the complex's communal restaurant takes on a very different flavour. If one cannot comfortably accommodate one's offspring within one's own home, then the childcare centre starts to feel like an urgent necessity. The possibility of communal luxury degrades into the erosion of residents' autonomy via a sense of intense spatial scarcity. As Hayden notes, the tension between public and private space within communal dwellings has frequently generated difficulties of this kind, all too often leading to the uncomfortable compromise or outright sacrifice of people's personal freedom for the supposed good of a wider group. She's clear that this does not make for a sustainable model of communitarian socialism, arguing that the experience of all historic and contemporary groups attempting to replace private property and territory with communal property and territory shows nothing so disastrous as forced deprivation of privacy. It is not a means of creating community. Hayden is optimistic, however, about the possibility of balancing competing needs via the manner in which such communities are conceptualised and planned, and in the possibilities of reinforcing this sense of balance through judicious neighbourhood, architectural and interior design. To her mind, the provision of adequate private spaces within co-living or cooperative households makes such communities eminently more hospitable to individual needs. So what insights can we glean from our final interwar case study? What can Stockholm's collective house teach us about possible emancipatory futures for residential dwellings? We need to ensure that the spatial methods we propose to counter material hegemony do not unduly erode autonomy, and we must be aware of the ways in which domestic geographies place restrictions upon individual choice, the choice to assemble a different kind of family, for example. In Hayden's words, community members should be drawn to communal territory by the provision of pleasant, clearly defined places where amenities are concentrated, rather than driven to such territories by desperation and need. As with all postwork projects, experiments with living space should orient themselves towards building capacities and extending freedoms, rather than simply imposing different but equally restrictive expectations upon social subjects. This is a matter of opening up currently curtailed choices and of creating the ideological and material infrastructures required to synthesize new desires as accessible, feasible choices. It is the task of engineering a space for life choices capable of disrupting domestic realism. Unfortunately, all 3 of the case studies that I've discussed today ultimately proved inadequate to this admittedly quite enormous task. So the Frankfurt Kitchen proved to be hugely influential when it came to the fitted kitchen and its development. But coupled with the commodity mania and rising domestic standards of mid-century suburbia, it quickly lost its emancipatory edge. Vienna still enjoys this relatively strong culture of social housing, as we've seen, but commentators fear that this is gradually being eroded, sort of nibbled away at by private developers. And the scope of its influence has, in practice, proved somewhat limited. The collective house, too, failed to exemplify a widely marketable type of urban housing, and many residents moved out of the city centre complex within a decade of its completion as processes of suburbanisation began to take hold. And yet lessons can perhaps be learned from both the successes and the failures of European interwar social housing, and certain provisional proposals distilled from these. So as we've seen, maximising the possibility of time away from unpaid domestic labour was explicitly included within ambitions of some interwar mass housing projects. If political conditions were today to turn in favour of massive investment in social housing, which by all accounts seems to be totally inconceivable and absolutely necessary at the same time, could this kind of ethos be retained? And how could the design of contemporary schemes be tailored towards this end? So I'm now sort of progressing to what is always the very worst part of every academic paper, which is when somebody tries to advance a positive thesis. So I'm going to have a go, but this is very much a set of directions or principles rather than a developed blueprint for change. One key step for me would be to organise around a call for the better integration of domestic residences and communal services. So Hayden pursues this line of thinking in her now classic article, What Would a Non-Sexist City Be Like? In imagining a metropolitan cooperative made up of 40 households, she demands the following collective spaces and activities. 1, a daycare centre with landscaped outdoor space, providing daycare for 40 children and after-school activities for 64 children. 2, a laundromat, providing laundry service. 3, a kitchen, providing lunches for the daycare centre, take-out evening meals and meals on wheels for elderly people in the neighbourhood. 4, a grocery depot connected to a local food cooperative. 5, a garage with 2 vans providing dial-a-ride services and meals on wheels. 6, a garden or allotments where some food can be grown. 7, a home help office providing helpers for the elderly, the sick, and employed parents whose children are sick. The use of all of these collected services would be voluntary. They would exist in addition to private dwelling units and private gardens. So this suggested schema feels sort of as aspirational now as it must have done when Hayden first advanced it in 1980. It offers a vision in which the temporal burdens of social reproduction would be substantially mitigated by community-steered services and spaces, many of them operated by residents themselves in return for an equitable wage. Could we envision Hayden's metropolitan cooperative as a directional demand for future forms of social housing? What happens if we take up her original question and restate it? What would a post-work feminist city be like? Simply reducing the travel time and forward planning required to access vital community resources like childcare, elder care and shops would have obvious post-work benefits for those currently performing feminised reproductive labour. But there are several steps one could take to extend Hayden's vision and to update it for the 21st century. A phone and computer repair shop, for example, with a mobile team of technology troubleshooters might prove to be a useful resource for anyone whose Wi-Fi router has ever inexplicably stopped working. There could be high-spec, communally accessible maker spaces, including everything from screen printing facilities, sewing machines and kilns to top-of-the-line 3D printers. A staff of technicians, ideally drawn from local residents, could be available on site to support people in realising their projects. Something similar could be put in place for media suites, enabling local people to produce and disseminate their own content, for music practice rooms, gyms and studios. Local medical centres could include some self-help health facilities where appropriate, for anybody who would prefer to use them. For younger residents and those that care for them, there could be a book and toy library, an ecologically friendly reusable nappy laundry service, a baby clothing rental service, regular breastfeeding support groups with peer counsellors available for home visits, pre- and postnatal mental health groups, a homework help centre and so on. In this vision, the better integration of home and neighbourhood not only frees up time from some of the more onerous elements of unpaid domestic labour, but presents a vision of social reproduction in which it's easy to imagine how this free time might be enjoyably spent. Beyond helping us to articulate these admittedly very broad principles and ideas, however, the examples I've sketched out today serve an important purpose. In all 3 case studies, the work of the home is understood as a problem which requires new thinking. As such, they invite us to understand that quiescence in the face of domestic organisation is not a transhistorical phenomenon. The home as it stands has not always been seen as an untouchable part of life, but a territory open for renegotiation. At the most general level, this willingness to push back against domestic realism is what I want to advocate for. We need not assume our current version of the household to be inflexible. We can, through political struggle, make it subject to change in the name of a more emancipatory set of labour and gender relations, and find ourselves at home in the future. Thank you very much.